So today, from the jungles of Costa Rica, first trip with Nikon's 400 TC. It is the dream lens that I knew it was. We've got some stuff to talk about, teleconverters, not teleconverters, why it's so amazing, as well as, what would you call it?
Maybe a horror story.
A horror story, but also a triumphant story of how durable Nikon's gear is. Yeah, I had a scary one.
A horror story with a happy ending.
Well, hey everybody, welcome to this week's video. I got David Archer with me, and we're in one of David's favorite places.
We are, Costa Rica.
The Osa Peninsula.
Fourth time here.
Wow, yeah, David loves it. We just ran our second workshop together here with the unbelievable guide, Dennis Valverde. If you haven't seen our video from the Sights and Sounds, you can click right up there, or I'll link it in this video's description. But we had an amazing time, and it was my trial run with the lens David's owned for a long time that I have been jealous of, to say the least. I've been able to use it. I think most people who watch this channel regularly know that the one piece of glass I didn't have Nikon makes that I really wanted was the 400 2.8 TC for the Z system with its built-in 1.4 teleconverter. And you know, I've shot David's enough. I have the 800 PF, which is an amazing lens. That's what I shot with last time here in Costa Rica, and I got beautiful stuff. But the 2.8 light gathering ability, the ability to blow the background to smithereens, the way that this lens renders contrast, and what is it? Is it a little sharp?
A little bit sharp.
Do you ever sharpen images that come out of it, really?
Hardly ever.
Yeah. It's
no sharpening. No sharpening required.
Yeah, it's a very, very sharp lens. And it's also sharp when you throw the teleconverter and you wind up with a 560 f4. But I feel that on the Z9, with its 47 megapixels, you kind of get four lenses in one without even touching a teleconverter. How does that work, David?
Yes, that's exactly it. Because we've got DX crop mode.
Right. And that still leaves you with how many megapixels?
About 20.
Yeah.
Roughly.
Which is about what we have with the D500 that we all loved so much for wildlife in action.
Yeah. Right around what my D5 had, which I shot for years.
And I found myself here in the jungle. I don't know, you can see behind us, a lot of the work we do involves fast-moving small creatures in dark forest conditions, complicated. You're trying to find it and get it in these little gaps between the leaves and think about having the right background that's nice and green and blown away. And a lot of times 4.8 is nicer to get those interesting shallow depth of field backgrounds and a little bit lower ISO in these dark forests. So sometimes you want a little more reach. Knowing that I'm going to crop down the road, I'd rather hit my function 1 button that I have programmed to DFX FX switch and boop, and I have that little indicator, the warning, so it's flashing in the top right of my screen telling me I'm in DX. And then all of a sudden I've got, you know, sort of the reach, the framing of a 600 with that 400 T.8's beautiful blurred background and the faster aperture, the lower aperture with the shutter speed I need to freeze motion. And then sometimes you've got a subject that's far away and good light, there's not that distracting a background, you throw that 1.4 teleconverter and all of a sudden you have a 560 f4. If it's still a little far away, hit the DX button, and what is it, like 8?
Yeah, right under 800.
Yeah, 780, something like that.
Yeah, 780.
Boom, you know, with the f4 aperture, which is pretty darn sweet. And then it takes
no loss of quality.
No. And then it takes the teleconverters, the external teleconverters. And we're actually going to jump into the studio and I'll show you some images from this trip taken with this lens. And I made it kind of a point to shoot things that are examples of all the different ways that this lens can be shot, as well as bringing along the 1.4 teleconverter and the 2.0 teleconverter. And I'm going to do some better analysis when I'm home before this video launches, looking at it on my big 30-inch BenQ monitor. And just make sure, but I think I don't need the 2.0 teleconverter. I think the 1.4 teleconverter that I love to use with the 100 to 400 is still sharp when you have it on this lens and throw the internal teleconverter in front of it. I think it's still plenty sharp, and it gets you something like 800.5.6 or 845.6 or something. And then you've got a 560 when you turn that off. So it becomes a really nice lens for birding and things that are a little bit further away. So let's take a look at some images. I'll walk you through image quality with this lens, and then we've got a little bit of a fun horror story that I don't know if you're even going to believe. All right, so here through the miracle of technology, we are in the future in my studio in Portland, Oregon, and looking at some images from Costa Rica and from my kids' grade school, looking at some of these brick wall images here just to kind of test that 400 TC with the different teleconverters, the 1.4 and the 2.0. As well as there are some images from the field in Costa Rica. I'll be showing you also some images that are shot in DX crop mode on the Z9. And you can see these are red. I've coded those red so you can tell right away if I'm shooting in that cropped in reduced megapixel mode. And I'll explain why you would or wouldn't want to do that along the way. I'm also leaving this left panel open so you can see what view I'm in. And when we jump in and look at an image bigger in the loop view, you'll be able to see how it was shot. And all these images are going to be wide open because, you know, why else would you be using a 400 2.8 with a teleconverter that takes you to 560 f4 if not to be shooting it wide open? If you're going to stop it down, you might as well buy the 400 4.5 for a lot less money, size, and weight. So anyhow, let's just jump in. Let's take a look at these images. This is the bare lens, shot wide open, no internal teleconverter engaged. And as David and I have been talking about, it's just razor sharp, wide open, center of the frame to the edge. And none of these images have been sharpened beyond what just default comes into Lightroom. None of them have been cropped. Just some light, black and white point contrast moves. That's all that's happened to them. Let's take a look at it with the teleconverter engaged. So here we are, wide open f4 560, still sharp as a tack. Awesome. I mean, you would expect it, right? You've paid for it to be sharp as a tack and awesome. All right, well, let's take a look at the same focal length, but using an external 1.4Z teleconverter instead of the internal teleconverter. And this is where it kind of surprised me, everybody. I mean, I found that over at Photography Life, when they reviewed this lens and looked at it with teleconverters, they found the same thing. Really sharp with the Z teleconverter, the 1.4. I don't know if I just have a great example of that teleconverter, but like my use of it with my 100 to 400, I'm just really impressed with how sharp it is. Let's compare it. We'll hit compare view between it and it's on the left with the 1.4 teleconverter and the internal teleconverter on the right. I don't know. I mean, neither one of those are a least bit disappointing. They're both just great results. I'd have no problem shooting this lens if I was after smaller, more distant subjects with the 1.4 on it. If you don't need the 400 and you don't need the 2.8, that gives you the reach of suddenly being able to get out to 784 millimeters when you throw the internal 1.4. And we'll look at that. Let's have a look at that. So I'm going to go back into my loop view and take a look at it at 784 millimeters. We've thrown the internal teleconverter in front of the external teleconverter. So we're putting 1.4 on it twice. Wow. I mean, still really sharp. I thought this would have some deleterious effect, and having read Tom Hogan, who I really admire, he worried about putting all those pieces of glass behind the lens. But, like Photography Life, I'm finding the results are wonderful. And then let's have a look at the 2.0 teleconverter. Now, my problem with using the 2.0 teleconverter on this lens and having shot a fair bit with it in Costa Rica is that it really puts the weight of the lens further out from the body of the camera. And one of the beauties of this lens is that it's really back weighted to make it easy to handhold. Suddenly, when you put the 2.0 teleconverter, all of the controls and your hand position move further out, the weight of the lens moves further out, and it's just more tedious to handhold. And the controls are in a less advantageous position. I don't notice it as much with the little skinny 1.4 teleconverter, but the 2.0 is a fatter teleconverter, and it just makes the lens feel harder to use. But here we are, 800 millimeters, just the 2.0. The internal teleconverter is not engaged. And, it's good. It's sharp as I look at it edge to edge. I don't think it's that much better than the 1.4. If we go to compare view here, the 1.4 paired up, both of them engaged, really similar. I mean, really similar results. I think at the edge, the 2.0 teleconverter might suffer a little bit more than the 1.4 doubled up, which seems nuts to me. You can see where we are in the image over here. Just crazy performance with the two 1.4s doubled up, and that feels like a more versatile combo to me. And again, the handling is nicer. So that was just interesting. A surprise for me. We'll look at some real world examples here in a minute too. Not that a brick wall isn't the real world, but you know, not something you want to be photographing all the time. So here we are at 1120. I've thrown the internal teleconverter. You can see the edges getting a little soft, but the center, it looks pretty good. You know, it's surprising for 1120. You've got a 1.4 teleconverter in front of a 2.0 teleconverter, surprisingly good in the middle. I think that my 800 PF with the 1.4 teleconverter might have been a little bit sharper moving out to the edge, pretty similar in the center. And then it's hard to use in frame at 1120. You wind up getting heat hazes and things like that. I guess occasionally with a small bird, far distance away, it could be useful. Let's have a look at some real world stuff. So here we are, you know, with the teleconverter engaged f4. This is a tiny baby crocodile that was out in the crocodile pond the first night I got into Puerto Jimenez. It's right where we stay on the workshops at Botanica. You know, here we are, f4, 560. Wow, you know, this guy was not moving at all, sitting still, pretending to be a log, waiting for some little prey to come. And so I engaged the teleconverter. And you can see, you know, we're down to about the same megapixels as the old D500. We're down to like 20 megapixels as compared to the you know, 45 megapixels with the Z9 or the Z8 in full frame mode. But the benefit of DX is it lets me really crop in how I more envision editing the image in post. I know I'm going to throw away a lot of that superfluous edge, and I get to view it nice and big in my viewfinder and make sure focus is sharp and watch for an interesting moment to happen in a larger view in my viewfinder and capture less data to bring into the computer. If I know I'm going to crop it afterwards and there's not much motion, why not crop in to DX mode? And that's given me the equivalent cropped in of 840 millimeters. You know, it's 560 times 1.5. That's about 840 millimeters. All right, so now let's have a look at it with the 1.4 teleconverter on. This is the equivalent to the internal teleconverter. So, you know, again, having a look here, wow, yeah, I don't think we need to compare. Both of them are sharp. There's just no problem with either one of these images. They're both nice and sharp. This is the internal teleconverter, or the external teleconverter. If I throw the internal teleconverter in front of the external teleconverter, now we're suddenly at 784 millimeters. Wow, still nice and sharp. This little guy really wasn't moving, so I had time to swap teleconverters. I threw the 2x teleconverter on, so now here we are at 800 using the 2x teleconverter. And let's compare those two, because that's where we're looking at, you know, which teleconverter will we want. And I close this down, and we'll zoom in a bit. Yeah, I don't know. Again, you know, some of it's the light changing a little bit as I put the teleconverter on, but I kind of like the 1.4. They're both sharp. Neither one of them I'm going to toss out as being a junk image, that's for sure. Both are plenty sharp. And then just for fun, we'll have a look at that 1120 image, you know, with the 2.0 teleconverter and the 1.4 in front of it. And as I said, you know, you've got your focus point more in the middle on your subject. It's nice and sharp. Again, this looks great. And usually this is what you're going to have. You're going to have a blurred, out of focus background with your subject sharp when you're shooting at 1120. You don't need edge-to-edge sharpness. You need your subject sharp, and it seems to be doing just a fine job of that. So we'll just look at some other images from the trip. This is a little baby coati that I ran into. I was shooting birds, actually. There was some toucans moving through the trees, and I was at 1250th of a second. And all of a sudden, I saw this little guy and snapped this frame, you know, 560 f4, internal teleconverter, not external. And I mean, look at, we're at 11,400 ISO, and look at how clean this is without even pulling a noise slider or denoising this image. It's just an incredible time to be a photographer with this technology. It's amazing. Speaking of the toucans, nice shot of the toucan. Was moving around collecting these fruits, so sharp at f4. You see what David Archer says about not much need for sharpening in post. Backing out to that 402.8, you just see that shallow depth of field, razor sharp where you want it sharp. Beautiful blown backgrounds. An example of when you might want to try playing around with engaging the DX mode in your Z9 or your Z8 with this lens. And you know, this little bird was sitting pretty still, looking at me through the brush, and you know, when it did move, it was moving fast, but it sat here for a minute. And I like the framing at 560 f4, but throwing the 1.5 DX mode in, suddenly I got the equivalent of 840, really fill the frame with this little guy. Again, obviously I can crop to that and accomplish the same thing, but this lets me view him big in the viewfinder and look for that moment with the nice pose and really see what I'm doing full screen in my EVF. And you know, if the bird's not moving around, why not? Times when you wouldn't want to do that, well, these crazy birds, and I can't recall their names, but they actually, the males fight with these little spurs on their wings. They were flying around fast, erratic, complicated flyers. They were far enough away that I wanted to be at 560 f4, but I didn't want to try to track it at 840, and I can really easily crop in post, all right, to get that same effect as throwing the teleconverter, and it makes it easier for me to track. With a bird in flight, I don't know why I would switch to DX mode. It just makes it more difficult to track. Here's another example of that with a macaw in flight at 402.8. I might as well crop in post. You know, I don't need to throw that DX mode to get the 600 millimeter view. And having that 2.8 depth of field really lets those palm fronds blow beautifully away in the background. A subject where I just start in DX mode, something far away, small, that I want to be as big as possible and view in the viewfinder big, the moon. This is a half moon during the day. We were photographing sloths, and suddenly I noticed that the moon was pretty up there in the blue sky. So here we are, you know, at 400, but I'm in DX mode. If I hit my information display, you can see I'm at that 20 megapixel crop, similar to the D500's resolution. And nice and sharp, I'm at 2.8. I'm actually getting a field of view equivalent to a 600 because I'm in DX mode, cropping in on that full frame sensor. Then if I throw the teleconverter, now all of a sudden I'm at an equivalent of 840. And you guys have realized by now I've decided to send back the 2.0 teleconverter. I've actually already sent back the 2.0 teleconverter. But I'm keeping the 1.4. So, you know, I had time. The moon's not moving. Throw the 1.4 teleconverter on there. Stay in DX mode. Now 784 times 1.5. I'm at 1176 millimeters still. Nice, sharp image of the moon. Really similar to what I could get out of the 800 PF with the 1.4 teleconverter. Cool, cool stuff. And I'll leave you with this one image. You know, this was the last day of the workshop. We were out on boats on this beautiful wild river, and I didn't bring either of the teleconverters. I just didn't want to be switching on the boat. And this is how I'll use this lens 90% of the time. You know, this kingfisher was sitting there. We waited a while to see if he would go into flight. It seemed like he was very, very content on this power line. And I thought, well, this is a great example to show everyone how this lens really functions in the field, how you would typically use it with a distant subject like a smaller bird. So here we are at 402.8, beautiful blown background, a little bit of distractions with these trees back there, but whatever. Bird small, but razor sharp as expected. And then you throw the 1.4 teleconverter, the boat's drifting a little bit, even better background, bigger, more beautiful. I get to see this in the viewfinder, bigger and nice and sharp still at f4, gorgeous background bokeh. And then you hit your DX button, and you really get a nice big view. You get to crop in camera and really fill the frame with your subject. That's really how I envision using this lens 99% of the time, just without any teleconverters. It really does give you these sort of 3, maybe even 4 lenses in one. You're at 400 millimeters, 2.8, working great in low light. You want to get a little bit closer, but you don't really want to boost your ISO. You touch the DX button, you lose a few megapixels, but you come in closer to your subject, more like your final frame's going to be in post. You stay at 2.8, you get the field of view as if you were at 600. If
Instead, you don't really worry. You've got bright enough light. You can throw the teleconverter instead and suddenly be at 560 f4, still with all 45 megapixels from the Z8 or the Z9. If you want to come in a little bit closer, yeah, you throw that DX button and you got the equivalent of 840 millimeters with the same resolution we had with the D500, which makes me more than happy in most conditions. So it really is super versatile. When you throw the teleconverters into the mix, even more so. Now, in my particular case, I've decided not to keep the 2.0 because I'm not going to be in situations where I need it that much and I don't like the way it makes the lens handle. I think for those people that shoot small birds at long distances, it's something you should consider. You should at least consider that 2.0 teleconverter. It handles it quite well. But the 1.4 was a real revelation, and I'm very, very happy because that's the teleconverter I like to use with my 100 to 400 on lighter weight excursions too.
All right, so you having watched what I'm about to do in Portland when I get home, probably know more than me whether I'm keeping the 2.0 teleconverter, but I would guess I'm not. And we have, I think anybody looking at these images can tell, you know, if you have the resources and you love to shoot wildlife and birds, I think once you've had this, you'll have a really hard time getting rid of it. Oh, I want to also really quickly talk about some accessories for this lens, and I'll jump into the studio to do that too. I think Carl Zemlin has made some just incredible stuff for this lens.
And I really love his eyepiece replacement too.
The eyepiece for the Z9, Z8, and ZF. I have become convinced it's better than the Hidman's, more durable and more just versatile, vertical, horizontal. As much as you flip this camera horizontal to vertical, it's really nice to have the round eye cup, and it's really nice. So.
Folds back out of the way. It's durable. It doesn't come loose. All the other ones always come loose.
And his hoods are amazing, and the multiple lengths. I really like this long one that's just really protective. It's built, it's on there tough. I've been carrying the camera like this through the field by it. It doesn't come off easily, and it's protective, and you can actually set it on the ground and review images without stooping way down with your camera balanced on the hood. It's been great. So.
Yeah, I may have to try one of those too.
It's a fantastic, fantastic system. Easy to put on, and I just think it's nicer. It's got a little rubberized rim around it to keep you dropping from your camera. We also have these little blanks that replace the standard strap lugs. That was something that bugged me on this lens. David has these strap lugs on his, and they stick way out, and the way you put it in your camera bag, the foot has to go up, and those strap lugs stick out to the sides. It's just not my favorite design. So Carl whipped up a set of these blanks to replace it with where they don't stick out of the lens at all for me for this trip, because I just mentioned it to him. He has the lens. He said, that's a good idea. And you know, I had these sort of overnighted to me and made it in time for the trip, which made it easier to pack. I don't think very many people are tying straps to this lens that way.
And something else I'll have to have too.
Yeah.
You know, he and I had this peer pressure thing going back and forth, and we have for years. You know, I get something, Hudson gets it. Hudson gets something, well, I want it too.
You do have a Leica Q3, I think.
Yes.
And the 105 1.4.
Right. Yeah, the Q3 was the big one for me.
Yeah. Well, this one.
And so now I'm getting you back on this.
Well, the 500 PF was one for me, and then this but this has just been something I've wanted for a long time. And I know, you know, you're such an artist with it. It's been fun to follow you through the jungle shooting with it. But I will tell you that the first night that we went out, you know, I had just gotten this lens. I took a few pictures of my cat at home, threw it in the bag. We come out here and we got to the hotel. David showed up and I was like, oh, let's take our lenses out and shoot in the jungle. You know, there's a lot of beautiful stuff to shoot right where we stay at Botanica in Puerto Jimenez. And we started walking out the door, and I'm not used to such a long hood. You know, that was a new thing to me. And I have the handle, and it's really hot and humid here. And the handle, you know, it's metal, and I have the Really Right Stuff foot. And I was walking along, and I hit the door with the hood. And the hotel where we're staying is all stone tile. It's hard stone tile. There's no give to it at all. The hood, it hit the hood, and it ripped the camera and lens out of my hand, and it dropped, thankfully, on the hood, which took some of the impact on this, you know, because it's 3D printed and it's a little bit flexible, and then it bounced back onto the camera and it hit on the Z9 on the back corner of my L bracket. There's no damage to the camera's body, but the camera and lens split in half without hitting the bayonet release, and half of the mount was on the lens, and half of the mount was still bolted to the camera, and there were little screws and pieces of copper everywhere. It was night one before the workshop's about to start.
It was horrific.
I was not in a great mental space, I put it that way. We were supposed to go shooting with Dennis the next day. So I shook the lens and I heard something rattling. And I remember I shook it a long time, and I finally got one of those little copper pieces. It's like a spacer in between the two rings of metal that make up the mount. And we found all the screws. David was out actually way far away from where it happened. He found a screw and another piece of copper, and we had all 4 pieces of copper, all 4 screws. We didn't have a screwdriver that size, so we Googled, you know, where's a hardware store? And we hopped in the rental car, we drove into Puerto Jimenez, and we go into their version of a Home Depot. And we found a little tiny screwdriver that fit those screws. We brought them with us. It was a 0 Phillips. And we bought some Teflon tape. They didn't have Loctite. We got some Teflon tape, and we wrapped those tiny little screws in Teflon tape. And I wish I'd filmed it, but I was distraught, and I wasn't in a space to be filming anything.
No,
I was just
it was bad.
Praying that things were going to work. I'd actually tested the lens on my ZF, and it worked fine, but thinking of shooting wildlife with that's not what the ZF's for. I mean, I could do it, and the lens was focusing and shooting. Everything was fine with the lens. That was a huge relief to me, but the Z9 was concerning. So we got all the little copper pieces put in place, and it's like tiny little, you know, we're using reading glasses and getting these things positioned right, and they have a little notch they fit into. And then we got the piece fit down over the bayonet mount release, and we got the 4 little screws toted in Teflon tape, and they held. And I thought, you know, I don't want to over tighten it because they've got to be somewhat stripped, having popped out. Clearly Nikon made them to release, but they went in and they held, and I put the lens on, I turned on the camera, I picked it up very gently, I started framing stuff up and shooting. And for the last week, I've fired tens of thousands of frames. I've been carrying it around. I've gotten to the point where I'm just not worried about it. I've tested those screws 3 times. They haven't loosened at all. Everything's working great. The minute I get home, I have a little break, and the Z9 is going back to Nikon for a little, you know, CLA and bayonet mount replacement. But I mean, this Nikon gear is incredible. You know,
That's Nikon. Takes a licking and keeps on ticking.
Well, hopefully Timex isn't going to sue him, but
Yeah.
you know, I did a video years ago when the Z6 and Z7 first launched, because I think people thought, you know, they originally launched with the autofocus really hinky, and it took a couple of firmwares to get to where it was much better than people thought it was. And they also thought they were small and they wouldn't be durable. And I had this incident where I got inundated by a saltwater wave. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
I did a whole video on that right after my
Thor's Well.
It was at Thor's Well. I was during my Bandon workshop, and I'll link that video too. I mean, someone was shooting me when it happened, so there's photographic evidence of how big the wave was that inundated me. And that camera, I poured a liter of water over it, opening every part of it, cycling the lens while I had it pouring water from my Camelback. Let it dry in the wind, and that camera never had a hiccup. I shot for years with it without any kind of repair after that. So I've seen these cameras blow down, hit the deck, bounce, get picked up, dusted off, bend something back into place, keep shooting with it, get it to the doctor, Nikon fixes it, and you keep rolling. So the gear is well made. All right, so I think you can tell I love this bad boy. I'm grateful that I didn't destroy it before I got to take a picture here with the Z9 or destroy my Z9. And we've had a hell of a good time on this trip.
We have.
Yeah, it's sad I have to go home, and not so sad for David because he's hanging out for another week, traveling around, scouting for potential workshop adventures in the future. All right, so we'll be doing in office hours. We do those on Tuesday mornings, 10 a.m. Pacific, relatively regularly. You can sign up for those at hudsonhenry.com/office hours. Big free photography get-together meeting. Click right here. You can go down in this video's description. All the stuff that we talked about in this video is linked in this video's description. You can run over to hudsonhenry.com/ATS links, and that's got all the gear that I use, stand by, live with, and recommend. And those links help us out with the content that we create for this channel, so we appreciate your using them. Anyhow, again, I hope you're all finding interesting things to photograph. It's a great time of year. Spring is springing in the northern hemisphere. Fall is gorgeous in the southern hemisphere. Everybody have fun, stay safe. We'll see you next week.
See ya.